Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we start, I would like you to use your imagination. I would like you to imagine that you do not sit here in Palmengarten, but that you sit in a boat, and that we are all sitting in this boat together. And we're all rowing together as a team towards a goal in the far distance. And obviously, on that way to that goal, we face challenges, we face obstacles, we have storms, and we have bad weather. But we can reach our goal if we all work together as a team. So this journey can be compared to the journey we are all on our goal towards a sustainable economy. And like our little boat trip, it is not an easy journey. It is a journey with challenges. And that is normal. We can reach our goal, but one thing is new. We have now reached a point where our team does not really work together anymore. Some people on the team just stop rowing. Some people on the team start questioning whether we are rowing towards the right goal and start throwing obstacles in the water. And this little picture, ladies and gentlemen, to me describes quite well the situation we are in at the moment in our energy transition path. And together with my guests, I would like to discuss where we currently stand following the announcements, for example, of the new US administration on climate, what this means for Europe, and what we can do to finance the energy transition. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome three distinguished experts on stage. I would like to welcome Dr. Mekala Krishnan, partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. Please join us on stage. I would also like to welcome on stage Jörg Eigendorf, Chief Sustainability Officer at Deutsche. Welcome, Jörg. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Variankaval, Managing Director and Global Head of Corporate Advisory at J.P. A very big applause to all of you. So if you come a bit closer to me, so we always share one of these cubes together. So let's start with the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen, the US elections and what are the implications. Mekala, Frankfurt Digital Finance is an international conference, and we are delighted that you took the journey from Boston, where you're located, to join us here in Frankfurt today. So first of all, thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You serve on international committees, you published a lot of research on climate, on globalization, and you can give us a really global perspective. So can you just explain to us, after the US elections, how has the global landscape changed with regards to sustainability issues?
Great, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and be speaking to all of you. I'm a part of the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey's business and economics research arm. It's essentially our think tank that sits inside of McKinsey, and as Sarah said, I lead a lot of our research on climate and sustainability. So my answer to your question is it's changed, but not as much as one might think, and perhaps not in the way that one might think. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by the not as much? We've done some research on the state of the energy transition last year, where we took stock of where we are on the energy transition already today. And the fact remains that despite all the meaningful momentum that we've seen towards the transition, we are at very, very early stages of the transition. If you look across about 25 different scenarios for where our current trajectory of emissions would take us, the world is on track to get to about 2.5 to 3.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. In no scenario do we get to net zero even by the end of the century. So that's fact number one about where we are. Fact number two about where we are today is if you look at all the technologies that need to be deployed towards net zero, we've only deployed about 10% of technologies. So again, despite all the meaningful momentum, we're at very, very early stages of this transformation, in some sectors far below 10%. And then fact number 3 is that if you then think about what is the task of getting from the 10% to 100%, we've identified 25 physical challenges that need to get solved. What do I mean by a physical challenge? It has to do with building things. Ultimately, this is a physical transformation and making sure it works. If I take stock of those 25 things, about half of those things are in relatively easier areas. Things like building charging stations for electric vehicles, scaling up mining capacity for critical materials that are needed. But there are fundamental execution bottlenecks. About half of these challenges are in much harder areas, things like hydrogen, things like carbon capture, where the technologies still need to be proven and still need to be scaled. So I give you these 3 facts. We're at very early stages. We're not on track to net zero, and 25 physical challenges, with half in relatively easier but execution-oriented areas and half in more challenging areas. Not to be a pessimist, but to say that already this task was a challenging one. Despite all the momentum, still a challenging task. So what's happened post the elections? I think the landscape has changed, and you asked me this from a global standpoint. I know Rama can talk a little bit more from a US-specific landscape. If we think about the global landscape, I think there are 2 or 3 things that we are keeping our eye on as we think about US policies and its impact on the world. The first, of course, which everyone has talked about, is the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. To be honest, I feel like this is largely a signaling exercise. Of course, it indicates global cooperation starting to fray towards the transition, but I'm not sure how big of an impact that's going to have. So that's something that's gotten a lot of attention, but I'm not sure about the breadth of impact. The second is tariffs, and I think this actually in the global landscape could play a role, both depending on the magnitude of tariffs and how countries respond. It could start to change the global trade landscape, and if we think about the transition, start to raise the costs of some of the goods that we need for the transition. And then finally, the piece that I focus on has been getting, I think, less attention, is if you think about global finance, a lot of the financing needed for the transition needs to go to the developing parts of the world. We estimate that they would need to spend about 2 to 3 times as much as the developed world as a share of GDP for the world to get to net zero. So 2 to 3 times as much as a share of GDP relative to the developed world. Getting financing to flow to developing countries will rely on multilateral institutions at some level, will rely on public finance at some level, and that's the piece where I feel like this changing global landscape, there could be headwinds associated with that.
Okay, we dive a bit deeper into that, but now I'd like to turn my attention to you, Rama. Again, Frankfurt Digital Finance International Conference. You've come over from New York, so thank you very much for taking that journey to be with us today in Frankfurt.
Thank you.
At J.P. Morgan, you overlook corporate finance, M&A structuring, the Center for Carbon Transition, Sustainable Solutions, as well as infrastructure finance. Having said that, you deal with many investors and many corporates. So what are they saying to you at the moment in this landscape?
I think, look, it's quite a different picture in the US and the rest of the world. I think, to Mekala's point, the change in administration has been, I guess, received by different people quite differently. Any change in administration in the US has an impact, right? It doesn't matter, and this particular change seems perhaps quite significant, even relative to other presidential changes. But if I look at the US landscape, the US has always been a pro-growth story, right? The only way to kind of get votes and to move forward is to sell a pro-growth story, and obviously the current president and the Republicans did a better job doing that. And they are going fast and furious about ensuring growth in the US. Tariffs, right? All kinds of domestic content in US-produced goods, et cetera, right? Maybe a tax cut that's coming up, immigration policies that are going to perhaps look a little different than historically. So disruptive in many ways, but all with the aim of turbocharging the US growth. The US economy grows at about low 2% range right now. And the anticipation is, or the hope of the current administration is to take that to 3%. So all of this is, so It might seem, perhaps reading the popular media, that this is all chaotic and haphazard, but in my mind, there is a very clear goal. The fiscal balance of the US is pretty bad, as is Europe, as is the rest of the world. If you look at debt to GDP, the US has, I think, a credible path forward to grow out of the problem. Right? By growing the economy at 3%, we can actually shrink the fiscal problems. That's the goal. And when it comes to sustainability-related things, well, two things. One, the word sustainability is, I think, used quite differently in different places. In the US, we rarely use the word. And if you look at kind of, the climate aspects of it or the environmental aspects of it, there have been a bunch of executive orders that the president has signed which might impact them, but the impact, again, I agree with Mekala, are unlikely to be transformative when it comes purely to the climate side of things. There are other kind of social type issues, like DEI is a term that gets used a lot in the US context. There might be bigger changes happening in the social side than in the climate side. On the climate side, again, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive piece of legislation that the Biden administration passed, if that gets repealed completely, I think that is a pretty significant step. Most experts believe that won't happen. There might be marginal changes to offshore wind policy or EV sales, etc. But those are all going to be pretty marginal. So I think the US landscape actually looks pretty optimistic. I mean, again, I'm a banker. I'm paid to be optimistic. But I think we are feeling pretty optimistic in the US. The rest of the world is a different story.
On the IRA, we're going to talk about in a minute as well. But before we do that, I would like to turn to you, Jörg. You are at Deutsche Bank the vice chair of the Sustainability Committee, which is chaired by the CEO, and you're also the chairman of the Sustainability Strategy Steering Committee. And within Deutsche Bank's global perspective, I would now like to put the spotlight a bit more on Europe and ask you whether you feel that the latest announcements and developments in the United States are a risk or maybe even an opportunity for Europe.
They are a big risk, and there is some opportunity. The big risk is we have a disruptive US administration which acts incredibly fast, sometimes doesn't even care about what does the Constitution really say at the end. I mean, they just act. And Europe is not ready for that kind of speed. We are not positioned to react fast on a development like we are seeing right now in the US, where a government pushes through certain things. And we, for example, have a very complex legislation, directives like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and we're going to talk about that, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directives, the taxonomy, everything very, very rigid and complex and difficult to change very quickly. Now we are trying to do so. And government, which is effectively the EU Commission, with a parliament that doesn't give this commission automatically a majority like in most other countries, and then a very complex legislative process. So this setup may have been difficult in times before. Now it's getting impossible to really react quickly and decisively to global developments and the US administration. What does it mean for investments into climate protection and the fight against climate change? The US is super pragmatic. When I talked to Rama, and we sat down yesterday, Rama and Mekala, and we discussed a lot of things, they are fast. They just say, okay, they do the things that Mekala describes as low-hanging fruits. They do them quickly. And if we think about 10%, which we are doing, and 50%, which we could do, then I'm a little bit afraid that I'm not afraid, but the challenge will be that the US may pick up these 50% while we are discussing the other 50% and love these sky in the pie projects. I mean, European politicians love to talk about hydrogen, but let's face it, that is in the box 3 from Mekala's analysis and not in the box 1, which we can do right now. And this is somehow the problem and the challenge. So it may not be a bad news in the fight against climate change. We'd rather have to think about how can we get faster and attract more investment to get these things done quickly.
Thank you so much for that assessment, Jörg. And now we'd like to discuss a bit more on the Inflation Reduction Act, which has already been mentioned by you, Rama. If we think about these three boxes once again, what do you think can be done now, given that the Inflation Reduction Act, where do we stand on that? Do we see no investment in climate anymore, reduced, different? What's your assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think building on what Jörg and Rama have said, one philosophical change, and I think it's an important philosophical change that has happened with the energy transition or the net zero transition more broadly, is the world has stopped thinking about this as just emissions reduction as the goal. And I think there's a growing recognition that emissions reduction needs to go hand in hand with affordability. It has to go hand in hand with reliability, and that's everything from reliability of the grid to reliability of supply chains, and it has to go hand in hand with industrial competitiveness. So I think firstly, that's like a very important mindset shift that we're seeing, and I think that echoes Rama's points about growth, and it echoes Jörg's point about the pragmatism of let's get going on the things that are in the money now, that are low-hanging fruit now, things like energy efficiency, things like getting charging stations up and running, etc. So if I take that and then think about that in the context of the IRA, there's all this debate about will the IRA be repealed, will it not be repealed? If you bear with me for a moment, I will take you down the road of how US legislation actually works, right? So the IRA, if we think about what the Inflation Reduction Act had in it, I'm vastly oversimplifying, but at its core, it had two components. It had a bunch of tax credits that were given, and it was tax credits for incentivizing manufacturing, incentivizing investment, and incentivizing things like EV purchases. So there was the tax credit side of things, and then there was the loans and grants side of things. So it was actually giving out cash, right? The loans and grants side of things, actually a large part of that was dispersed as a part of the Biden administration. So that's in some sense done. The tax credits, which was a huge part of the IRA, I think there's two things to watch for there. The first is that actually the vast majority of tax credits actually went to Republican states, right? So think about that. About 75% of IRA tax credits went to states that are red states in the US, and there's actually a lot of support in the legislature. If you need to repeal the IRA, the legislature needs to play a role. There's a lot of support in the legislature for those tax credits because it's resulted in growth and jobs, right? So going back to how the narrative has shifted. However, on the flip side, and the other thing that we're watching for is another part of the big presidential agenda is tax cuts. To pass tax cuts in Congress, you need to balance the budget. So tax cuts need to, the revenue lost from tax cuts need to be balanced in other ways, which is partly why the tariff agenda is so front and center, because if you lose revenue from tax cuts, you could gain revenue from tariffs. Now, if there is a sense that in the executive branch, meaning the presidency, that those two things cannot offset, that's when things like IRA repeal and repealing tax credits from the IRA will come into the picture. So that's the balancing act that we're watching. On the one hand, this support for the IRA because it's created jobs, but on the other hand, this desire to pass tax cuts and the IRA as an offsetting mechanism for that. How this will all play out is uncertain, but I think what the sense that we're getting, as Rama said, is that there's not going to be a full-on repeal, but there may be selective changes to specific forms of tax credits because of this reconciliation with the tax cut agenda. So that was a little bit of a wonky US constitutional exercise. Apologies for that, but I think it's important to really dig into the details of this versus the headlines, which can come across as quite alarming.
That's definitely...
So nuance matters in the world, in fact.
Yeah. No, that's definitely worth explaining to us, that insight from the United States, which is brilliant. Rama, I would now like to shift the focus again a bit more internationally, away from the United States, because you also deal with many investors, with many corporates outside the United States, also in emerging economies. So what's your take? Where do we stand there? Also, considering again these three boxes that Mekala mentioned before, what can be done, what is difficult to do, what is really very complicated, where do we stand in the other countries?
Sure. So first of all, maybe on the IRA, I think, again, the US mentality always was, doesn't matter who the president was, things have to make commercial sense, right? If I'm the CEO of a company, I'm making an investment. If I can't credibly show that the project or the investment makes commercial sense, there was never really a whole lot of appetite in the US to invest. Value signaling had a little bit of place in the menu of things they considered, but very limited. What I think the environment change has, the vibe shift as we are calling it in the US, what it has done is made that more unapologetic, so CEOs don't have to worry about value signaling. They can just go back to saying, I'm paid to make commercial decisions, to look at projects, to figure out whether it makes sense, am I being a good fiduciary of somebody else's capital, right? And the IRA, the reality is there are tax credits in things like solar or onshore wind that predate the IRA, right? The IRA just kind of made them slightly permanent. I don't expect that to change. And there are certain things like hydrogen credits that are not in the money. Even with the tax credits, hydrogen is not an investable green commodity at this moment in time, right? And so, again, back to the point that it's unlikely that the Trump administration will repeal IRA, but even if they repeal big parts of it, I don't think the trajectory of US investments into climate changes materially. Outside the US, by the way, I mean, Europe, sorry, I know I'm in Frankfurt, but I'm going to be slightly controversial and say, look, imagine in the US, we are, people are thinking about inventing the car. In Europe, they're thinking about inventing the seatbelt, right, without inventing the car. It's just the mindset is all about what regulations can we put, how can we constrain bad behavior. While in the US, it's like accept that there will be bad behavior, but unless there is bad behavior, there won't be spectacular behavior either. So it's just a completely different mindset, and I think the rest of the world is, the places I'm very familiar with in Asia, in Far East or in India, the sentiment is definitely more aligned with the US. Very commercial, it's not a political issue. If I go to India or China, they don't talk about climate in political terms. They talk about it in a very commercial, to your point. It's a growing population, we still need to make the population more prosperous. That means we need more energy. Air quality is terrible. If you have been to Beijing or Delhi, it's terrible. So it's not like a 2100 problem. They're talking about today's problems, that I can't breathe the air. So I know that I have to cut down coal plants. Again, not for net zero goals, not for my grandchildren, because I can't breathe the air today, right? But it's okay, that's fine. It's a slightly different mindset, but they are trying to do all the right things in my mind. They are demonstrating that they can actually think about the problem in multiple timescales. China is absolutely the best at it. While they're burning a lot of coal, they're also investing a lot in climate tech, whether it's nuclear or carbon capture or whatever else, right? So that ability to think about the problem in multiple timescales and to think about it with a very commercial sense is what I find in most places outside Europe. Europe is just, I think, bogged down with this regulatory mindset that I think is holding back the immense potential the continent has. You have fantastic universities, fantastic research labs, fantastic engineers, all the talent, I think not being harnessed, unfortunately, in the best possible way.
Fantastic financial institutions.
You must say. Rama, please, come on.
I would like to take that picture that you just mentioned, that in the United States you build cars, and in Europe we think about the seat belts, when we come to our next topic, which is actually regulation and reporting. Because when we think about Europe, and you all mentioned that, regulation and reporting is very complex. And the new EU Commission just announced quite recently to simplify rules, which is positive. The omnibus package targeting CSRD, CSDDD, the taxonomy. And Jörg, you attended the omnibus simplification roundtable last week. So what can you share with us? What was discussed? Is there any hope for less seatbelts in Europe?
Yes, there is hope. First of all, we really welcome that initiative. Mm-hmm. You need to think about legislation directives which have grown over many, many years. It won't be that easy to simplify, because Europe had this approach of we create a super perfect taxonomy which maps the whole economy, then we create a green asset ratio, and then we eventually, everybody will just try to increase that, and we have this reporting directive with more than roughly 1,200 I don't call them KPIs, indicators somehow, and hugely complex. And there are pieces, parts, and now we have to dismantle it a bit, and we have to be, the legislators have to be very bold. And Europe has the problem really to be so granular in all of that, that eventually we are looking at all this data, and please look at the CSRD reports, which will come out now, and look at the green asset ratio reports. We have 101 bank, BBVA, for example, will have 140 pages of green asset ratio reporting. I thought we have a lot with 70 pages, and we beat Allianz with 40 pages, and there are only zeros in there. So this is super complicated. We need to get to a point where we are much more pragmatic and eventually think about these first 50%. When we think about this regulation, and what it should do is it should make investment more likely. But this is not the case. The taxonomy is so complicated that many of the investments needed for the transition are excluded because of do no significant harm. So you just have them outside. So it's disincentivizing and not incentivizing. And the whole reporting, if you have so many, we report on 150 indicators of those 1,200. These are not KPIs, these are not PIs, so no key performance indicators, no performance indicators, these are indicators. We then have to look again, what are the key performance indicators? We cannot steer a company towards that many indicators, and they will never find their way into the steering, and that needs to be understood. And to do this now, in this legislative process I mentioned before, this will be very tricky and needs a lot of leadership. So President von der Leyen she has set out a really ambitious goal and target, and there need to be some bold moves. You cannot repair it here and there. That means, for example, maybe park the green asset ratio for a couple of years, and let's not do that. Maybe take at least the do no significant harm out of the taxonomy. These are very bold moves to make it simpler, that we eventually end up with a system which then can be a competitive advantage. I think in a situation like the US banks right now, where you mustn't use ESG and you shouldn't use sustainability, we think this is a strategic part of, this is an incremental part of our strategy. We really want to drive this forward. We think this transitioning is super important. We need to make investment possible. And by the way, just in the last 2 weeks, we have closed deals in project finance with 3.5 gigawatts in Australia, in Poland, in the UK, wind farms, offshore wind farms, energy storage. The deals are happening. And we are proud of that, and we want to drive this effort forward and want to talk about it and don't park it. So that's the opportunity of Europe. If we can create a simple framework, and we also can talk about double materiality and all these things, and align it with the ISSB, by the way, and I think this is very important. Have an alignment. We have these international standards, which are now eligible in many countries. Why do we have to be so much more complex in Europe? So we have the International Sustainable Standard Board in Frankfurt. Let's align CSRD with ISSB's framework. Think a little bit about double materiality and make it super simple. If we get this done, that would be a huge success. Can we get it done? The jury's out.
What do you think from an international perspective? How do your clients, your investors, how do you look at Europe?
At Europe? Well, I think there's a little bit of the seatbelt question. We've done some analysis of Europe to look at what really is the distinction between Europe and the US. And there are many things that you can get into, but one thing that is immediately obvious is that the amount of investment that Europe is making relative to the amount of investment that the US is making is far less. And this is because the engine of competitiveness is not working as effectively as it could be. And so I think it goes back to how do we move away from thinking about just regulation, but thinking about these as growth opportunities. I'm going to say something that's maybe controversial in a room full of bankers, but actually we need to focus on the real economy, right? We actually need to think about how we actually deploy capital in the real economy, how we build up new forms of startups, how we think about business building for large incumbents. I think this abstraction that's happened both as a consequence of a focus on finance and as a consequence of a focus on reporting is unhealthy, because ultimately the real economy is the thing that needs to churn. So that would be my plea. Let's not just think about dollar signs, let's think about the real economy.
Perfect. Think about the real economy. And I guess there's also something we have to think about, because we are at the Frankfurt Digital Finance Conference, so I can't really let you go without talking about technology. That is obviously a very big driver, and this is why my question to you, Rama, is how can we use technology and artificial intelligence in particular to really reinforce that path towards more sustainability?
Look, I think clearly AI is the most important thing happening in the world right now. I mean, AI, and again, every second poster is AI, right? Which is very pleasing to see. AI is, it's like electricity or the printing press, right? It's a general purpose technology that's going to impact everything. There is a debate going on, I think, globally and definitely in the US as well, about AI's power needs, right? It's very energy intensive, and is that taking us a step back when it comes to sustainability? But the reality is just the big four US technology companies who are in the AI space, that's Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon, they have committed to spend about $320 billion in capex in this coming year, in 2025 rather, right? $320 billion, that's four companies. So they have unlimited capital, pretty much. This is also the first time that these big guys are actually going head to head on the same topic. If you kind of look at the history, each of them made their, got to $1 trillion company, is pursuing very different strategies. Someone was a cloud player, someone was an e-commerce player, somebody selling SaaS, whatever, right, search engine. Now they're all going head to head. And so I think AI is going to be is the biggest unlock of climate technology that I am hoping, right? We've already, again, if you follow the US news, you will see that the big guys have already committed to reopening some closed nuclear power plants. They have committed to invest in small modular nuclear reactors. So there is geothermal is another area where the hyperscalers are investing in. So they have unlimited access to capital. They have a very strong commercial reason to invest in energy transition. And they have very strong climate goals, right? So they've historically had very strong climate goals. So I think AI is going to be actually a transformational thing. The other thing I'll say is, again, Europe, back to Europe. I mean, as I said, I'm pleased to see so much AI posters here, but the reality is I can't really name a globally relevant European AI company today. And that has to scare people. Right? The most important thing going on in the world in Europe is on the sidelines. Right? I can name at least one Chinese company now, right, after what happened in the last month, but I can't name a European one. And I think Europe really focusing on economic prosperity and what's going to take the economy forward has to be the number one priority. And then hope that all of the other things will fall in place.
Can I just...
yeah, please, Jörg.
Just add one statistic, which I think is just something that we should all deeply sear into our minds around data centers. So, and both Jörg and Rama have heard me say this before. If you think about the power demand from data centers, as Rama said, everybody's up in arms about massive power demand from data centers. First time power demand has ever increased in the US in the last 10, 20 years. What's it going to do for the energy transition? At best, estimates suggest that power demand from data centers in the world globally would be 10% by 2030. Okay, so think about that 10% number by 2030. Maybe if you believe you're more aggressive about AI prospects, maybe it's 15%, 20%. If you think about the net zero transition in the way that the world is envisioning, getting to net zero by 2050, 1.5C aligned, what is the expectation of how much power demand would increase? Because you're electrifying mobility and you're using heat pumps and you're electrifying heating in industry. Any guesses? You guys should both know. It's 300%, right? So we're talking about 10% completely disrupting the energy transition conversation, and instead we should be solving for a 300% increase of power demand. So in fact, the glass half full version of the AI story is every conversation we were going to be having eventually anyway about what's the role of nuclear? How do you scale up transmission and distribution capacity? How do you balance the grid? How do you think about demand-side flexibility? What's the role of hyperscalers? These are all conversations we would have been having anyway, and we're having them now. So that's my glass half full with data centers on the energy transition.
You would like to add something, Jörg?
Yes, first of all, I think what Mekala makes very clear is we need to electrify our economy. And that should be and you don't hear, in Germany, e-vehicles, it's almost treated like sustainability in the US. Heat pumps, it's a no-go. I mean, permanent changing environment on these things. So the main basic stuff, an infrastructure, creating an infrastructure so we can have to electrify the economy does not happen. I think AI will also play a role. Why does AI, for example, for us is so important? Think about that our Scope 3 emissions, roughly 80% is caused by 1% of our clients. When we talk about transition, we will need to analyze, and these are a couple hundred of companies, we need to analyze these companies up and down. In the old world, you have somebody sitting there collecting transition plans, reading through these transition plans, and then eventually we make an assessment and come to the conclusion this is a good transition plan, this is not a good transition plan, we should bank this client because this client has a future in a transitioning world, and so on and so on. With an AI tool, you get 80 to 90% of this stuff done, and then you can refine the rest. So, and transition will be about data transparency, and there the thinking, by the way, of the EU is fine, this is great. We need data transparency. We need to have data standards. But think then, once you have agreed on not 1,200, but on 100, then you have AI tools behind it. There will be, give you an example, now come all the CSRD reports. Let them scan with AI tools. You will get the insights which are amazing, and then you can steer the transition much better. We have to make financing decisions in our banks every single day, and we need to make good decisions, and we cannot afford to finance something that is pie in the sky, which is not bankable. Or we need about how do we get these pie-in-the-sky projects, which will be important eventually, how do we get financing solutions for that? But for all of that, you will need eventually AI, otherwise you won't compete.
Unfortunately, I have to take a very bad decision now because I have to stop our discussion as we are running out of time. So very briefly, to sum up, Rama, 3 key ideas to facilitate investment in sustainable finance.
First one, stop villainizing any sectors, right? Don't point fingers at the fossil fuel sector and blame them for the problem. Number 2, invest in AI. Even if it's not obvious how it's going to help, it will help. Third is think bold, right? I mean, the reality is we're not going to get to net zero by just doing more solar and wind. We're just not. We need some breakthrough in either battery technology, long-term, long-duration storage, or nuclear fusion, or advanced geothermal. So invest with a bigger risk appetite.
Perfect. Mekala, your 3 ideas.
For scaling sustainable finance?
Please.
Okay, so I think number 1, I would agree with those, but I would add low-hanging fruit, people. We've estimated of the 50 gigatons we're emitting today, there's about 19 gigatons that we can do that cost less than $20 a ton, is getting less than 5% of investment needed. I'm talking energy efficiency, I'm talking methane capture in oil and gas, I'm talking avoided deforestation, I'm talking about further scaling the first bits of solar and wind, transmission and distribution infrastructure, lots of low-hanging fruit, let's get going on that. The second, as Rama was also alluding to, this is the first thing that I talked about is the first 50%. The rest of the 50%, in addition to what we do with the low-hanging fruit, we also need to invest in innovation for the future. Now, that will come with increased risk appetite, but it will also come with the real economy. So therefore, invest in the real economy. And then the third thing I will say is that we do need to think about a change in mindset. This net zero by 2050, I think it was a helpful rallying cry, but I think what it's done is it's created false constraints to the problem. Instead, we should think about bending the emissions curve. Today, we've only ever once lowered emissions globally. That was when we shut down the global economy during COVID. So let's talk about what we can do to bend the emissions curve today. Change of mindset.
Jörg, to conclude, your 3 proposals for the new German government.
Jumping on what Mekala just said, be super pragmatic and non-ideological and non-technology based in one or the other direction. do the heat pump stuff, the e-vehicle stuff, all of this very, very clearly. So get the low-hanging fruit, those those easy to do things to decarbonize. Second would be, we have so much uncertainty in today's world, and for investment, uncertainty is the worst. We have inflation going up and down, we have wars, we have governments taking fast decisions, and so on and so on. Be very reliable in what you're doing. Don't change laws immediately because heat pump, the Heizungsbauförderungsgesetz may not be the best art in the world, but right now you see a lot of people investing into heat pumps because they are afraid that the new government will get rid of this law. So be careful. And the third one would be get more engaged in Europe, because we really need a strong German government in Europe. When I look at the European Commission and how we treat it, in my area, 90% of the stuff is done in Brussels, and I need to go to Brussels in sustainability, and only 10% is done in Germany, so in the German parliament. So let's focus how we get Europe stronger. We need a united Europe, a capital market union. We need a strong Europe. Otherwise, we play no role at all. We cannot counter anything that is happening anywhere else in the world. We need a strong Europe, but it needs to be able to act fast.
Okay, thank you so much, Jörg. To conclude, I'd like to refer back to my picture from the beginning, where we all sit in the same boat. And with that picture in mind, I would really like to thank my panelists for giving us a US, an international, a European, a German, a global perspective. Thank you so much. You mentioned so many obstacles on the journey. You identified ways to go around, and I hope that we will find ways to row together towards that goal again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.